There are a couple of tutorials and discussions regarding JSON files and how to work with them inside Unity. It usually covers only very basic examples using the built-in package JsonUtility, or indicates to install an external package called Newtonsoft to handle more complex structures. But what if I told you that we can use the built-in package to deal with complex data? And it is practically the same approach as using an external package, with the benefit of not having to install anything new. This is what this tutorial is all about. Let's use what is already installed to handle our game development needs. P.S. Special thanks to a great friend that enlightened me with the wisdom that I'm about to share with you. Before we start, let's cover some basics here. A brief explanation of what a JSON file is and how to work with it inside our game. A JSON file is nothing more than a text file, where we represent data using simple conventions. If you are familiar with Python, it is the same as the syntax for a dictionary. You will see the format in our example. We want to load this data and use it inside our game, as well as save the data from our game into the file. Converting the data from text to code is called deserialization, and converting it from code to text is called serialization. In our context, deserialization is loading data, and serialization is saving data. However, only the objects responsible for saving and loading this data might not be enough to use it inside the game. Therefore, we will also need to establish a connection between the actual game objects and these serialization objects. Let's jump into our example to demonstrate how we can apply these concepts. Starting with the JSON file, let's create it through the file manager directly. It is important to place this file where it can be accessed in runtime after being deployed to a device, since it is a save file. Therefore, we will place it inside a special folder called Streaming Assets. Let's create the folder and the corresponding save file. And yes, we will be civilized and use the JSON file extension here, and not just a pure TXT file. For this example, we will have the name of the level and a list of enemies that we want to spawn. Each enemy will be represented by a species, a health value, and an attack value. With this example, we will cover what most tutorials and discussion forums don't do. That is, showing how we can nest these custom structures within each other and deal with them using the JsonUtility library. Now we can start creating our serialization classes. We need to create classes that match the data inside the JSON file so that we can load and save the data, converting from text to object and vice versa. What I recommend is to create a separate file for these pure C# classes so that we can access them easily using different scripts. With this, we can have separate files for loading and for saving data, using the same serialization class objects. Let's create a scripts folder and create our JSON Serialization Classes script. We won't need any of this code, and now we have some very important orientations here. If you do not respect the details I'm about to tell you, it will not work when you try to implement this in your project. We need to create classes that have fields that match the data exactly. Let's start with the enemy data. Each enemy has these three fields: species, health, and attack. So we must create a class with these three fields. The class and the fields will be public, and the name of the class doesn't matter. We will call it enemy data because it makes sense. This public class has public fields that are exactly the keys that appear in the JSON file. If the variable name doesn't match the JSON key name perfectly, it won't work. Another important thing is, these serialization classes that will be used inside other serialization classes must have the system serializable attribute above the class definition. If it doesn't have this, it won't work as well. Now that we have our enemy data class, we can create a class that will contain all data from the complete JSON file. Since this is the class that encapsulates everything else, it doesn't need the system serializable attribute. But only this one won't need it. Let's call it save data, and remember that the fields must match the key names in the JSON file. For the enemies, we have a list of enemy data objects. And this is the necessary structure to serialize and deserialize using Unity's built-in JSON package, JsonUtility. With the basic data structure created, we can create the load and save script. But first, let's create a prefab to hold the future load and save components and start with the load script. On our load data script, we will deserialize the data into our custom serialize class. For that, we will create a method. Let's call it load data from JSON. In this method, we need to read the content of the file and convert it to our saved data object. Therefore, we need to import system.io to handle the file. First, we get the path to the JSON file, and that is why we placed it inside our special folder. And now we can read all text content. Using this string, we convert it to a saved data object using JsonUtility from JSON. To visualize that we properly loaded the data, let's show something in the console. Finally, we call this method inside the awake function. It is a good practice to place data handling code on awake, so that all other objects can run on start, knowing that data is properly set. Running the game, we can see that data was properly loaded. Here we have data inside our game code, but how can we really use it to do something inside the game? For this, let's create an enemy prefab, and for tutorial purposes, it will be a simple cube. We also need to create a script component for it. Now we create the fields to store data of this enemy. We also need to create a public method to set all these values. At this point, the enemy has all data that it needs and can do whatever it should do inside the game. For tutorial purpose, let's just create a do something method to change the name of the object and print out a warning message. Now we must update our load script so that we can create our enemies and use the data inside of them. Therefore, we will need a spawn enemies method that we will call on start. And it is called on start because awake will already have loaded all data. Then we can instantiate the enemy using a variable to hold the enemy prefab asset and call the setValues method from the enemy component we just created. By running the game, you can see that 3 enemies were created in our scene, each with its proper name, and the warnings also show they were properly placed inside the game. Now we know how to load and use data in the game. To wrap things up, let's see how we can save data from the game. For this example, we will start from the serialization object directly. It would be necessary to store the current game information somewhere so that I could demonstrate the complete flow of data as I showed you for loading the data. This will take some extra time and would be a bit out of scope for this tutorial. But I intend to create another video demonstrating how we created our save system for our fish game. Spoiler alert! We use scriptable objects and use a nice approach to make it work just fine with JSON. Enough talking. To save, we will create a save script component and add it to the save and load prefab as well. We will first create a save data to JSON method and we will call it onDisable. This is just so that we can test it out in the game by disabling the game object. It is similar to the load method we created before, but now we start by serializing the data and then saving the text into the JSON file. But for this, we must first create a sample data object, starting with some enemy data objects. Then we store it in a list. And finally, we can add everything to a new save data object. After running the project, we see our enemies being loaded as before. But now, when I disable the save and load object, our JSON file is overwritten with our save data. As you can see here, we have our new data in our JSON file. And that's it for this tutorial. Thank you for your time and patience. Don't forget to leave a like if this tutorial helped you. If you have any questions, write a comment and I'll be happy to answer them. I want to create another video to show how we implemented a save system for our mobile game using JSON and scriptable objects. Subscribe to stay tuned. See you soon. Bye.